There are secrets a palace keeps in its walls, in its silence, in the careful eyes of the men and women who stand guard at its doors and never speak unless spoken to. And then there are secrets that walk right through the front gate on a Tuesday morning, glittering at the throat of the wrong woman. It was a guard named Thomas Ashworth who saw it first. He had stood at that same post for 11 years. He had watched coffins leave and children arrive. He had watched a crown pass from one head to another and had not blinked, because that was the job. You did not blink. You did not speak. You did not feel anything that showed on your face. Not ever. Not once. But that morning, something cracked open behind his eyes. Because he knew that brooch. He knew it the way you know a scar on someone you love. Not because you were told about it, not because you read it somewhere, but because you were there. He had stood 6 feet away the last time it was pinned to a coat. He remembered the light. He remembered the day. He remembered what it meant to the woman who wore it, and he remembered very clearly that she had taken that secret to her grave. Or so everyone believed. Camilla, Queen Consort, walked past him without a glance. The brooch caught the pale London morning light and threw it back like a small, cold fire. Thomas Ashworth did not move, did not breathe wrong, did not let a single muscle in his face confess what his mind was screaming. But by the end of that day, nothing inside Buckingham Palace would be the same. This is that story. Not the version the palace released. Not the careful, measured, press-secretaried version with its soft language and its strategic silences. The real version, the one that moved through the staff quarters like smoke before anyone could open a window. The one that 3 senior aides tried to stop before it reached the press and failed, quietly and completely. It starts with a piece of jewelry. It ends somewhere much darker. And in the middle of it, a man who was paid to see nothing saw everything. Thomas Ashworth had been a royal guard for 11 years, 4 months, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 days, though he had stopped counting after the first decade because counting made it feel like a sentence and he did not want to think of it that way. He had chosen this. He reminded himself of that on the mornings when his back ached and the London sky looked like wet cement and the tourists lined up outside the gate at 7 in the morning with their cameras and their excited children pointing at him like he was an exhibit. He had chosen it because his father had done it before him and his father's father before that, and because there was something in his blood that understood discipline the way other people understood music. Not as a thing you learned, but as a thing you simply were bone deep, without apology. He was 34 years old. He had a flat in Pimlico with a broken radiator he kept meaning to fix. He ate the same breakfast every morning. 2 eggs, brown toast, black coffee, no sugar. And he read the newspaper in the old way, on paper, not on a screen, because screens gave him headaches, and because he liked the weight of it in his hands. He had a sister in Edinburgh he called every Sunday. He had no wife, no girlfriend, no complicated emotional entanglements of any kind, and he considered this not a sadness but a professional practicality. He was not by any measurement a complicated man, which is why what happened that Tuesday morning hit him so strangely. Because complicated men get rattled. Complicated men carry their wounds close to the surface where anything can brush against them. Thomas Ashworth was not built that way. He was the kind of man who could watch a state funeral and feel the appropriate solemnity and then go home and eat his 2 eggs and sleep 8 hours and wake up the same. He had done exactly that, in fact, more than once. So when something cracked inside him that Tuesday morning, it did not crack in any way that showed. It cracked in the deep internal place where a man keeps the things he cannot say at his post, the quiet archive of everything witnessed and stored and never spoken. That archive was enormous in a man like Thomas. 11 years enormous. The morning had started the same as every other morning. He had arrived at 6:45, changed into his uniform with the specific economy of movement that came from years of repetition, exchanged 11 words with his colleague Davidson, not because either of them was unfriendly, but because 11 words was all that was required and both of them understood this, and taken his position at the main gate by 7 sharp. The sky was that particular shade of February grey that felt less like a colour and more like an absence of colour. His breath made small clouds. The tourists were already there, 4 of them, a family from what looked like Germany based on the children's jackets and the mother's sensible walking shoes, and they aimed their cameras at him with the innocent rudeness of people who had paid a long way to get there and felt they'd earned it. He did not react. He never reacted. The morning moved in its ordinary way. Cars arrived. Cars left. Aides in dark coats walked through with the specific, hurried shuffle of people who had 17 things to do before noon. A delivery van spent 6 minutes at the side gate. 2 corgis crossed the inner courtyard with a handler, and the tourists erupted in sounds of delight that Thomas experienced as background weather. And then the car arrived. It was a black Jaguar, standard issue. Nothing that would draw your eye unless your eye was trained. Thomas's eye was trained. He saw the car before it reached the gate, and he read it the way you read a face. Make, model, the particular way it sat on its wheels. The tinted windows with their slight variation in depth that told him who it was carrying before the car had fully stopped. The car stopped. The door opened. Camilla stepped out. Camilla stepped out. Thomas had seen Camilla hundreds of times. He had stood 6 feet from her at 3 separate formal occasions. He had watched her walk this exact path through this exact gate on more mornings than he could count. She was a woman he knew by presence, by movement, by the particular way she held her shoulders slightly forward in a posture that was not quite a slouch but was not quite correct either. The posture of a woman who had spent decades navigating spaces where she was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, tolerated and resented and ultimately crowned, and who had developed a physical vocabulary that said, "I am here, and I know you have feelings about that, and we are all going to get on with our day regardless." He watched her walk toward the gate, and then he saw it. It was pinned to the left lapel of her coat. Her coat was dark navy, good wool, the kind of coat that disappeared into itself unless the light hit it a certain way. The light hit it, and in the light, the brooch threw back a small, bright flame of gold and deep green enamel, and something that caught the February morning and made it briefly beautiful. His lungs forgot what they were doing. He had seen that brooch before. He had not simply seen a photograph of it or read a description of it in a briefing document. He had stood 6 feet away from it on a grey October morning, 3 years ago now, when the woman who wore it had walked the same path for the last time. He had been on duty that morning. He had watched her the way he always watched, professionally, neutrally, as a presence to monitor rather than a person to observe. And the brooch had caught the light then exactly as it caught the light now, with the same cold, small fire. He had seen it again, weeks later, in the photographs from the lying-in state. It had not been on her clothing. It had not been part of the official photographs of the coffin or the flowers or the assembled family. He had noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of something your eye expects to find. He had thought nothing of it, or rather, he had thought something small and then set it aside, because setting things aside was what you did in this job. And now here it was, on a different woman's coat, walking through the gate as if it had always been there, as if it was simply a piece of jewelry a woman had chosen in the morning and pinned without ceremony to her lapel. Thomas Ashworth did not blink. He did not alter his breathing. His face stayed exactly as it always was, flat, composed, professionally empty. He watched Camilla walk through the gate with the brooch glittering at her throat, and he did his job, which was to stand there, and he did it perfectly. But behind his eyes, inside the deep archive, something that had been dormant for 11 years sat up and paid attention. He had been a young guard, just past his probationary year, the last time he had seen that brooch. He remembered the day with the specific precision that certain days carry. Not because they are dramatic, but because something in the body knows, in the moment of living them, that they are being filed, that they are going into the permanent drawer rather than the daily one. The Queen had been walking to a private car, not an official engagement, one of those quiet Tuesday exits that the press never photographed because they were never told about. She had been wearing the navy coat, her navy coat, a different navy than today, but the same spirit of it, and the brooch had been on her lapel, and she had been moving quickly for a woman of her age, and her back had been straight in the way her back was always straight, as if she had been born with a ruler for a spine. He had not been supposed to see where she was going. That was not his function. He was at the gate. He confirmed identities and managed access. What happened beyond the gate was not his knowledge base, but he had been young enough then to be curious, and his eyes had followed the car longer than they should have, and he had seen the woman who was waiting at the private entrance on the other side of the courtyard. He had not recognized her then. She was older, perhaps mid-70s, wearing a headscarf in the style of women who had grown up in the 50s. She had a particular way of standing, still in the manner of someone who had learned stillness not as a discipline but as a survival strategy, the way people who have waited a very long time for something learn to wait without broadcasting their waiting. The Queen had gone inside with that woman, and the door had closed, and Thomas had returned his eyes to the gate and his mind to his post and filed the whole thing in the deep archive and thought very little about it, until now. He thought about it now with a focus that was almost physical, a pressure behind his temples, as Camilla's car was waved through the inner checkpoint and disappeared toward the palace entrance. He stood at his post. He did his job. The tourist family was still there. the children now running short circles of restless energy while the parents argued quietly about something involving lunch. A second car arrived, an official aide, and Thomas checked credentials and waved it through. And his face did nothing, and his hands did nothing, and no one watching him from outside would have seen anything but a guard at his post doing his job. But the archive was open now. And once the archive was open, Thomas Ashworth had a problem, because the archive, once consulted, did not close easily. That was the cost of the kind of memory he had. Precise, orderly, thorough. The kind of memory that made him excellent at his job and occasionally difficult to live with. Or so his last girlfriend had told him 3 years ago, before she had gone to Edinburgh and then stayed there. Which was a separate story and not this one. He stood at his post for 4 more hours. In those 4 hours he processed 37 vehicle entries, managed 2 tourist incidents of moderate complexity, exchanged 22 words with Davidson during a handoff, drank 1 cup of tea from his thermos at 11, and did all of it with his full outer attention while his inner attention stayed fixed on a single image, the brooch, catching the February light, on the wrong woman's coat. The question was not whether it was the same brooch. He knew it was. His memory was not the kind of memory that played tricks. He had seen it twice, and it was the same. The specific shape of the central stone, the enamel work on the border, the small flaw at the lower left that looked like a single hair had been caught in the casting and was visible only when the light hit it at the right angle, the same. He was certain. The question, the one that sat in the archive and hummed, was how. Not how had Camilla come to own a piece of jewelry that had belonged to the late Queen. That had an obvious and acceptable answer. Gifts are given, estates are distributed. A daughter-in-law inherits what she inherits, and no one outside the family has standing to question it. The question was the one beneath that answer. The one that came from the memory of the woman in the headscarf, standing still in the way of someone who had waited a very long time. The one that came from the fact that the brooch had not appeared in any official photograph of the estate inventory. The one that came from the very specific and quiet certainty, built from 11 years of watching people walk in and out of this gate, that some things were given and some things were taken, and the difference between those 2 actions wore the same face. He went home at 3. He ate his eggs. He did not read the newspaper. He lay in his flat with the broken radiator making its small, insufficient sounds, and he stared at the ceiling, and he understood that he was standing at a particular edge, the kind that comes once in a life if it comes at all, and that whatever he did next would either matter or it would not, and there was no way to know which from where he was standing. He thought about his father, who had done this job before him and had kept his eyes forward and his mouth shut for 30 years, and had retired with a clean record and a modest pension and a handshake from a man he had never met and whose name was on the certificate. He thought about the woman in the headscarf and the particular quality of her stillness. He thought about the brooch. He picked up his phone, set it down, picked it up again. There was a man he knew. Not a friend. Thomas did not have many friends in the way people usually meant that word, but a man he trusted, which was rarer and more valuable. A man who had worked palace communications for 8 years before leaving to go private, who now did the kind of work that existed in the space between official and unofficial, the space that a palace generates simply by being a palace. A man who knew how things moved inside those walls and how they sometimes moved outside them. His name was Gerald Finch, and Thomas had not called him in 2 years. He called him now. It rang 4 times. Thomas was already composing the voicemail in his head. Short, nothing specific. Call me back. When the call connected, Thomas, Gerald said, in the tone of a man who had not expected this call but was not surprised by it, which was a particular tone Gerald had perfected and which had always slightly unnerved Thomas, the implication that he had been anticipated. I was wondering when you'd ring. Thomas held the phone. You saw something, Gerald said. I don't know what I saw, Thomas said. Which was true and was also not quite true, and Gerald would know that. Tell me, Gerald said. Thomas told him, carefully, in the compressed, precise language of a man who had spent 11 years learning to say exactly what was necessary and nothing more. He described the brooch. He described what he remembered from 3 years ago. He described the woman in the headscarf, her stillness, the closed door. Gerald was quiet for a long time. You understand, Gerald said finally, that if you're right about what you think you saw... I'm not thinking anything, Thomas said. I'm describing what I saw. Another silence. All right, Gerald said. Don't tell anyone else. I mean no one. Not Davidson, not your section supervisor, no one. Can you do that? I've been doing it since 7 this morning, Thomas said. Gerald made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Right. Of course you have. He paused. I'm going to make a call. I'll come back to you. Thomas, this is a very small thing until it becomes a very large thing. Do you understand what I'm saying? Thomas understood exactly what he was saying. I'll wait, Thomas said. He hung up. He lay back on his bed. The radiator made its small sound. Outside, London did what London did in February, existed in its grey and patient way, indifferent to secrets, indifferent to brooches, indifferent to the small human explosions that happened constantly behind its old stone walls. Thomas Ashworth stared at the ceiling. He thought about the archive, about the things that go in and never come out, and the things that come out at the exact worst time and the exact right time simultaneously, which was a contradiction that 11 years at a palace gate had taught him was not actually a contradiction at all. He thought about the brooch catching the morning light. He thought about the woman in the headscarf. He waited. In the morning, he would go back to his post. He would stand at the gate. He would check credentials and manage access and drink his tea at 11 and exchange his precise number of words with Davidson and do his job exactly as he had done it for 11 years. He would give nothing away. He would stand there the way he had always stood there, which was to say, like a man who had seen nothing, which was to say, like a man who had seen everything, which was, in the end, the same thing. But the archive was open now, and Gerald Finch had said he was going to make a call. And somewhere on the other side of London, in a palace that sat on its enormous history and breathed its enormous secrets, a woman had worn a brooch to breakfast that she perhaps should not have worn, or perhaps had worn deliberately, or perhaps had worn without knowing what it meant, which was the most dangerous possibility of all, because things worn without knowing what they mean have a way of meaning everything. Thomas Ashworth turned off his lamp. He did not sleep for a very long time. Gerald Finch had a rule about palace business, which was that there was no such thing as palace business, that was only palace business. Everything that happened inside those walls had weight that extended outward, into families, into careers, into the quiet lives of people who had never wanted to be anywhere near a crown but found themselves standing next to one anyway, blinking in the light, holding the wrong information. He had learned this rule the hard way. He was 51 years old, which looked like 47 on his better days and 60 on his worse ones, depending entirely on whether the thing he was currently managing had press exposure or not. He had a wife named Rachel who taught secondary school and who had, over the years, developed the particular patience of women married to men whose phones rang at inconvenient hours about things they could not explain at the dinner table. He had 2 daughters, both of them opinionated in the way that made him privately proud and publicly exhausted. He had a small consulting practice in a converted Georgian townhouse in Marylebone, and the brass nameplate on the door said Finch Communications, and if you knew what that meant, you did not need a longer explanation, and if you did not know what that meant, you were not the kind of person who would be coming through that door. He knew what the brooch was before Thomas had finished describing it. Not because he had seen it. He had not, but he had done 8 years inside Palace Communications, and in those 8 years he had encountered, in the way you encounter unexploded ordnance, carefully, from the side, without direct eye contact, certain items that existed in the gap between the official record and the actual record. The brooch was one of those items, had been for years. Not because anyone had publicly spoken about it, which was precisely the point. It was famous in the way that only things kept absolutely quiet become famous. Among the very small number of people who needed to know about it, it was enormous. He sat in his office after Thomas's call and looked at the wall for a while. His wall was not a decorated wall. It had a whiteboard on it, currently blank, and a single-framed photograph of his daughters from a holiday in Cornwall 3 years ago, and a clock, and nothing else. He found that decorated walls made it harder to think, too much to look at. He needed surfaces that gave nothing back. He thought about what Thomas had told him, and he thought about what he knew, and he thought about the distance between those two things, which was not as great as he would have liked. The brooch had a history. It was not a history you would find in any official record or auction catalogue or royal inventory document, because the history of the brooch was precisely the kind of history that institutions spend significant energy keeping out of official records. It had been made commissioned in the late 1950s, and its commissioning was attached to a relationship that had existed in the period before relationships of that kind were spoken about, before they were documented, before the word for what they were had found its way into polite conversation at all. The woman who had worn it last, and for decades before that, had received it as a gift that was simultaneously a secret and a declaration. The kind of gift that says, I cannot give you everything, that I am giving you this, and you will know what it means, and no one else will need to. And the woman who had given it, or rather the person who had arranged for it to be given, was a figure who existed in the official record as a minor historical note and in the actual record as something considerably more complex. Gerald had come across the brooch's history 3 years before he left Palace Communications. It had surfaced as a footnote to a larger document he had been asked to review for press sensitivity, a retrospective piece a journalist had been working on, the kind of long-form thing that respectable publications ran every decade or so, combing back through history with the slightly self-congratulatory energy of people who believe that knowing a thing 40 years after it happened makes them brave. The journalist had found a reference to the brooch in a private letter that had surfaced in an estate sale. The letter was vague in the way that people writing in that era were vague about certain things, ornate in its avoidance, almost acrobatic, but its meaning was clear if you knew what you were reading. Someone had known what they were reading and had flagged it to Gerald's department. Gerald had done what his department did, which was to make the problem go away through the specific and entirely legal mechanism of helping the publication understand that there were more productive stories to pursue at this time, and the current timing wasn't quite right, and perhaps revisiting in a few years, and so forth. The journalist had been reasonable. The story had not run. The letter had never been returned to circulation. Gerald had filed his report and moved on, and thought very little about the brooch for 3 years until it disappeared from his thinking entirely, which is what happens when you successfully manage a thing. But now Thomas Ashworth had called him, and Thomas Ashworth was not a man who called about things he had not seen. Thomas was the least speculative human being Gerald had ever met, which was, professionally speaking, one of his most useful qualities. He did not embellish, he did not interpret. He described what was in front of him with the flat accuracy of a man reading coordinates off a map, and he trusted you to understand what the coordinates meant, which meant that if Thomas said he had seen the brooch on Camilla's coat, then the brooch had been on Camilla's coat, and the question of how it got there was now Gerald's problem. Or rather, the question of who it was going to become a problem for was Gerald's problem, which was a different and considerably more complicated question. He pulled out his phone and looked at it for a moment in the way you look at something before you activate it, acknowledging the point of no return. Without ceremony, he called a woman named Diana Marsh. Not that Diana, a different one. Diana Marsh was 63 years old and had retired 2 years ago from a position in the royal household that was officially described as senior advisor, domestic affairs, and unofficially described by people who had worked with her as the woman who knows where everything is. Not metaphorically, literally. She had spent 31 years being the kind of person who made other people's problems manageable by being precise about where things were and what they meant and what the acceptable range of outcomes looked like. She was by any measure the best institutional memory that Palace had, and the fact of her retirement was, in Gerald's private view, a miscalculation of the first order. She picked up on the second ring. "Gerald," she said. Her voice had that particular quality, like tea that had been properly brewed, not rushed, not overextended. "I assume this isn't social." "It's not," he said. "I need your eyes on something." Not over the phone. A pause that he understood completely. This was Diana calculating, in real time, whether whatever Gerald was bringing to her was something she wanted to still be calculating about at her age, with her garden and her grandchildren, and her particular freedom from exactly this kind of thing. He understood the calculation. He had enormous respect for it. "Come for lunch," she said. He drove to Kew, where she lived in a narrow terraced house with an excessive number of plants in the front garden and a knocker shaped like a fox, which he had always found slightly out of character for a woman of her precision but had never commented on. She opened the door before he knocked, which meant she had been watching for him, which meant she had already been thinking. They sat at a kitchen table with tea and the very good shortbread she kept in a tin with a tartan lid, and he told her about Thomas's call in the same compressed way Thomas had told him, and she listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes slightly unfocused, which was her listening posture. The one that looked like she had gone somewhere else, but actually meant she was more completely present than anyone he had ever worked with. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Which brooch?" she said. Not a question. Confirming. "The Cairngorm," he said. This was not its official name, because it had no official name, but it was what people who knew about it called it, after the stone. Diana nodded once. She picked up her tea. "How long has she been wearing it?" "Thomas only saw it today, for the first time." "That doesn't mean it's new," Diana said. Gerald had been thinking exactly this and said so. Diana set her cup down and looked at him directly in the way she had, which was not uncomfortable exactly, but was not entirely comfortable either. It was the look of a woman who was going to tell you something true that you were not entirely going to enjoy. I'll tell you something I have never told anyone in the capacity of my employment because I no longer hold that employment and I am old enough to be done with certain kinds of quiet. He waited. There was a letter, Diana said. Not the one your team dealt with, a different one. It came to the household, came to me, specifically, because that's what happened with things of that kind. They came to me, in the January after she passed. Handwritten. No return address. The postmark was Edinburgh. Gerald very carefully did not react. It was addressed to the household in a general way, Diana continued, but its content was specific. It referred to the brooch by the name you just used. It referred to a private arrangement. It said that the arrangement had been honoured in the way that had been agreed, and it thanked the household, and it said the writer wished nothing more from anyone. Gerald processed this. You kept it? Diana looked at him with the expression of a woman who had spent 31 years being the person who kept things. She did not answer the question because the question answered itself. Who was the letter from? Gerald said. It wasn't signed, Diana said, but I had a very good sense of who it was from. She paused, and so, I think, did whoever made the decision about the brooch. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, an actual robin was doing something in the garden, red-breasted, bouncing on the fence, indifferent to the weight of what was being discussed 3 feet away. Gerald watched it for a moment. So the question isn't whether Camilla came by it improperly, he said. The question, Diana said, is whether it was ever intended to become visible. This was, Gerald understood, exactly the right question and also the worst possible version of the question. Because if the brooch had been given to Camilla privately, with some level of institutional knowledge, as the closing of an old private arrangement, the last gesture of an obligation quietly honoured, then wearing it publicly, where a sharp-eyed guard who had been at his post for 11 years would recognise it, was either a very large mistake or a very deliberate act. And in Gerald's experience, the people who lived inside those walls did not, as a general rule, make large mistakes, which left deliberate, which was its own category of problem entirely. There's someone who would know, Diana said. Gerald already knew who she meant. There was only one person who would know, with any certainty, whether the wearing of the brooch that Tuesday morning was an accident or a statement. And that person was the one person Gerald Finch had spent his professional life carefully not having to directly involve in anything. The king, not Charles. Although Charles was relevant and would need to be considered. No. The person Diana meant was a woman who had worked in the household for 24 years and who had been present in that private courtyard on the day Thomas had seen the late Queen walk in with a woman in a headscarf. A woman named Margaret Ellison, who was officially a senior household coordinator and unofficially the person who had managed, with absolute discretion for more than 2 decades, the particular and delicate matter of a small number of private arrangements that the Crown had needed to maintain without any paper trail, any official record, any acknowledgement of any kind. Margaret Ellison, who had retired 18 months ago to a village in Wiltshire and who grew vegetables, and who answered her phone, in Gerald's experience, only if she felt like it. I'll need something to take to her, Gerald said. She won't open the door otherwise. Diana went to a drawer in her kitchen, a drawer that was very organised, which surprised him not at all, and came back with a sealed envelope. It was old. The paper had the particular quality of paper that has been kept in the dark for a while, not yellowed but waiting. She set it on the table between them. What is this? Gerald said. A second letter, Diana said. One that came 6 months after the first, less polite. She looked at him. I kept that one too. Gerald looked at the envelope. He thought about Thomas Ashworth in his flat in Pimlico, staring at his ceiling with the radiator making its small sounds, waiting for a callback. He thought about a brooch catching the February light outside a palace gate and everything that had not moved in 3 years and was now, very quietly and very certainly, moving. He picked up the envelope. I need to go to Wiltshire, he said. I know, Diana said. She picked up their cups and took them to the sink, and Gerald understood that their conversation was over. Not because she was being unkind, but because she was being precise, which was the same thing as being kind in the end, for people like the two of them. He drove back through London with the envelope on the passenger seat, not touching it, just aware of it the way you are aware of something that has been in the dark for a long time and has now entered the light. His phone buzzed. A message from Rachel. Dinner at 7. Don't be late. Ellie's home. He would be late. He texted back. I'll try. He would not try. He would fail. He would arrive at 8:45 with the tight apologetic energy of a man who had spent the day in a kitchen in Kew being handed an envelope that had changed the shape of his week. And his daughter Ellie would roll her eyes because she was 19 and this was familiar, and his wife Rachel would look at him over the pasta with the expression that said, "I married this, and I knew I married this, and here we are," and she would hand him a glass of wine, and he would drink it, and it would help. And later he would lie in the dark next to her breathing, and he would not sleep, and she would know he was not sleeping, and she would not ask. That was for later. Right now, he was in traffic on the A4, heading east, with an old envelope on his passenger seat and a retired guard's phone call turning circles in his memory, and the particular cold excitement of a man who has spent 30 years handling things that matter and has just found himself holding something that matters more than most. The brooch, the woman in the headscarf, the Edinburgh postmark, the drawer in Diana's kitchen. Somewhere in a village in Wiltshire, a woman named Margaret Ellison was growing vegetables, possibly, and not answering her phone probably, and knew things that no one else alive knew about the transaction that had apparently ended 11 months after the late Queen had died, with the passing of a small piece of jewellery from one woman's coat to another's. Gerald Finch drove east and thought about doors. Some doors you knocked on, hoping to be let in. Some doors you knocked on knowing the person on the other side was already watching you through the peephole and had decided before your hand dropped whether they were going to open it or not. The trick, with doors like that, was what you brought with you. He had the envelope. He thought it might be enough. He drove. London fell behind him in its grey and complicated way, and the road opened up, and the envelope sat on the seat beside him and said nothing. Which was fine, which was appropriate, which was exactly the behaviour you wanted from a thing that had been in the dark for 2 years and was only now reluctantly coming into the light. The village was called Barton Stacey, which sounded like a place invented by someone who had never been to Wiltshire, and looked exactly like a place that had been invented by someone who had never been to Wiltshire. The low stone wall, the yew hedge, the narrow road that was not quite a lane but had given up most of its lane ambitions, the church at the center of things, which had probably been standing since before anyone currently alive had invented a reason to feel important. Gerald Finch arrived at 10:30 on a Thursday morning. He had driven down from London in the dark and grey of early morning, and the landscape had come up around him gradually as he moved west, the flat stretches opening into the chalk hills, and he had thought during the drive about what he was going to say, and had arrived at a version he did not entirely trust, which was typical of the best conversations he had ever had. Margaret Ellison's house was the third on a terrace of 4. It had a garden that was, by February standards, orderly, in a way that suggested it was actively tended rather than simply surviving winter. There were structures. Low raised beds made of pale wood, covered in mesh against birds, the soil dark and turned, a neat stack of terracotta pots against the south-facing wall, a tool leaning against the door that was a specific kind of fork, the flat-tined kind he used for potatoes. He knocked. He waited. He was aware, in a professional way, that he was being looked at before the door opened. There was a window to the left. He did not look at it. He stood in the place where he could be seen and let himself be seen and did not perform anything which was, he had found, the best possible approach when the person watching you was someone who had spent 24 years reading performances for a living. The door opened. Margaret Ellison was 68 years old and looked like a woman who had made a decision, at some point, to stop looking like anything other than exactly herself. She was compact, upright, wearing a waxed jacket over a green jumper, her grey hair cut short and not styled in any direction, her face the face of someone who had spent 2 decades keeping things and had retired and had given herself permission now to put them down. Her eyes were the particular shade of brown that photographs always flatten, and that in person had depth, a surface, and then something behind it that was paying attention. She looked at him. She said, "Gerald." She stepped back from the door without widening it, a gesture that said, "You may come in, but let's be clear that I am deciding this." And he moved past her into a hallway that smelled of old wood and something herbal, rosemary or thyme, something that grew rather than was applied. The kitchen was at the end of the hall, and he followed her there because this was evidently where they were going. And he sat at a table that was much less organized than Diana's, which had a different quality entirely. Diana's kitchen was organized because organization was her mode. Margaret's kitchen was lived in because living was what she was doing now. And there was a difference, and he felt it. She did not make tea. She sat across from him with her hands in her lap, which was a posture he associated with people who were comfortable in their own stillness. And she looked at him and said, "How did you find me?" "Diana Marsh," he said. Margaret received this information in the manner of someone unsurprised but annotating. "And what did Diana tell you?" "She told me about the letters," Gerald said. She told me about the brooch. She gave me something to bring to you. He put the envelope on the table between them, the way Diana had put it on the table between him and Diana. And he noticed this, the way things moved through hands. And he thought it meant something but could not say what. Margaret looked at the envelope. Her hand stayed in her lap. Her face did not change, which was its own kind of change. The specific stillness of someone who has been waiting for a thing and, now that the thing is here, is taking one last moment before the waiting ends. She picked it up. She opened it. She read it, which took perhaps 2 minutes, and during those 2 minutes Gerald studied the garden through the window, which was the correct thing to do, the thing that gave her the space to read in. And he thought about the kitchen in Kew, and the envelope, and the road through Wiltshire, and Thomas Ashworth's flat in Pimlico, and the brooch, and the way all of it had arrived at this table in this village in this grey February morning, with the precision of something that had been heading here for a long time. She set the letter on the table. She shouldn't have kept this, Margaret said. Her tone was not angry. It was the tone of someone noting an error in judgment in a person they respect, which has its own particular gentleness in it. She kept both of them, Gerald said. Margaret looked at him. There was a second one, he said. The one you're holding. Diana has the first.
Something moved in Margaret's face. Not quite a smile. Not quite not one. Of course she does. She folded the letter back into the envelope.
She set it down on the table between them, not returning it to him, not keeping it for herself, leaving it in the space between them, which he understood was intentional. What do you need to know? She said. Gerald had prepared several approaches to this question on the drive down, and he set all of them aside now, and said the simple thing, which was, I need to know whether what happened was authorized. Margaret considered this carefully. That depends, she said, on what you mean by authorized. He understood this to be a precise response rather than an evasion, because Margaret Ellison was not the kind of person who evaded. He had dealt with evaders for 30 years, and he knew what they looked like, which was the performance of someone talking around a gap that they hoped you would not notice. Margaret was not performing. She was making a distinction. Let me ask it differently, he said. The brooch, the transfer of it. Did the household know? The household, Margaret said, is not a single thing. Did Charles know? A pause that was not quite a pause. The kind that happens when a person is considering not whether to answer, but how much of the answer to give. Not at first, she said. And now? I can't speak to now, she said. I've been here for 18 months. What I know ends there. Gerald nodded. He was constructing, in his mind, the shape of what she was telling him. The way you construct something in the dark by moving your hands along its surfaces. You cannot see it, but you can map it, if your hands are careful, and your patience holds, he said. Tell me about the woman. Margaret looked at the garden. It was raining now, lightly, the kind of February rain that is more suggestion than weather. A mist that falls sideways in Devon, and slightly less sideways in Wiltshire. The raised beds were dark. Her name was Eleanor Hartley, Margaret said. She was born in 1942 in Edinburgh. She was a secondary school teacher by profession, history, which is a brief pause that might have been something personal in it, which is its own kind of thing. She never married. She lived her whole life in Edinburgh. She died 14 months ago, in her flat, of a stroke. She was 80-1. Gerald said nothing. I knew her, Margaret said, not personally, not socially. I knew her in the way I knew everyone who had, she paused, choosing proximity to certain things. I managed that proximity for 24 years. It was my job, part of my job. She picked up the envelope and looked at it without opening it. She wrote to us once a year, not demanding anything, not threatening, simply confirming that things were as they should be. It was her way of holding an invisible thread, I think, knowing the thread was there even if she never pulled on it. What was her relationship to the Queen? Gerald asked. Margaret set the envelope down. She looked at him with the full quality of her attention, which was considerable. You're asking the question you already know the answer to, she said. I'm asking for confirmation. Confirmation, Margaret said, is a thing that belongs to people who have institutional standing in relation to what they're confirming. She paused. Are you asking in an institutional capacity? I'm asking, Gerald said, as a man who has a very good and very discreet guard, who saw something he wasn't supposed to see, and who called me instead of his supervisor, and who is currently in his flat in Pimlico, waiting for me to tell him what to do. Margaret considered this for a long time, long enough for the rain to change quality, thickening slightly. and for the terracotta pots against the south wall to darken one shade. Eleanor Hartley was, Margaret said, carefully, precisely, someone for whom the late Queen had a long-standing private obligation. She let that sit. Then, the nature of that obligation is not mine to name. It was never mine to name. I managed the practical dimensions of it. That was all I did. Gerald understood. He understood in the way that competent professionals understand things that are simultaneously obvious and impossible. Things that restructure the context around everything you already knew without changing any single fact. The brooch was not merely a piece of jewelry. It was the last physical evidence of a relationship, the precise nature of which did not need to be named at this table in this kitchen, that had existed across the better part of a century, maintained with extraordinary care and extraordinary secrecy, and apparently closed, finally, with the passing of the brooch from wherever it had been kept to wherever Camilla had received it, which was itself a decision made by someone, at some level of the institution, that had either been a closing gesture or an opening of something entirely new. Who made the decision to transfer it? Gerald said. I don't know, Margaret said. He believed her. But someone at the household level would have had to know, he said. Someone at the household level authorized every significant transfer after the estate was settled, Margaret said. That's process. It's recorded. Not what the item is or what it means, just that it moved, and to whom, and on what date. Can that record be accessed? Not by you, she said. Not by Thomas Ashworth. Not without standing. But by someone. By someone with a specific reason and a specific authorization, yes. Gerald thought about this. He thought about who, in the current configuration of the household, had both the standing and the reason to pull that record, and what they would do with it when they found what they found. He thought about the gap between a thing being knowable and a thing being known, and the people who lived in that gap professionally, which was a population that included himself, and which had, apparently, until 18 months ago, included the woman sitting across from him. She wore it publicly, Gerald said. The brooch. Camilla. She wore it to the palace on a Tuesday morning, which is not a private occasion. She wore it where staff would see it, where someone who knew what it was might see it. Yes, Margaret said. Is that a mistake? Gerald said. Or is it something else? Margaret was quiet. I've thought about this, she said finally, which meant she had been thinking about it before he arrived, which meant she had known, or guessed, that something like this conversation was coming. I think it's possible it was worn without knowledge of its history. She may simply have been told it was a piece from the estate, chosen and given, and worn it as such. A pause. But I think that is the less likely explanation. Why? Gerald said. Because the people who would have arranged the transfer, Margaret said, would not have chosen that particular piece without knowing what it was. And people who know what a thing is when they give it are making a choice. The rain had stopped. The garden was very still. A blackbird landed on the top of the tall stack and looked at the raised beds with what appeared to be professional interest, tipped its head, departed. So someone wanted her to wear it, Gerald said. Someone wanted it to exist, Margaret said. In the present. As a present thing. After 24 years of it being a private thing, she looked at her hands. Whether that someone wanted it to be seen, that I can't tell you. Gerald sat with this. He thought about Thomas at the gate, the archive open, the crack behind his eyes. He thought about the precision of the brooch, catching the February light, the specific flaw in the lower left of the casting visible only in a certain angle of light, and Thomas positioned exactly where the light was right. He thought about the tourists with their cameras and the corgis and Davidson and the handoff at 11, and in the middle of all of it, a brooch worn on a coat walking through a gate where a man stood who would recognize it. Is there anyone currently inside the household, he said? Who would know the full history? Who was there from the beginning? Margaret picked up the envelope and held it and looked at it. There is one person, she said. There has always been one person in every era who held the complete shape of it, not in documents, in memory, the way certain people are entrusted. She set the envelope down and looked at Gerald and said, her name is Anne Prescott. She is 72 years old, and she has been part of the household for 41 years, and she has never once spoken about this to anyone outside. Not in 41 years, not once. She held his eyes. I say this to you not as a direction. I say it to you as a fact. What you do with the fact is your decision. Gerald picked up the envelope. He looked at it. He put it in his inside pocket and felt its small weight against his ribs. He said, I'm sorry to have brought this here. You didn't bring it, Margaret said. It was already here. She stood, which was the end of the conversation, and he stood, and they moved back through the hallway with its herbal smell and its old wood quality, and she opened the front door onto the February morning, which had cleared, and the garden was visible in the post-rain light, the raised beds darker, the terracotta pots gleaming.
He stepped out. She said, "Thomas Ashworth." He turned. "The man you mentioned. The guard." She was standing in the door, hands in the pockets of her waxed jacket.
"He's been in this job 11 years. "Yes," Gerald said.
"Tell him," she said carefully, "that what he saw was real. That the thing he knows is worth knowing.
And that the question of what to do with it is not as simple as what he thinks it is, but that he should not, for any reason, pretend he did not see it." She closed the door. Gerald stood in the lane for a moment, with the village around him doing its quiet village things. A car on the road, a dog somewhere, someone moving behind a curtain 3 houses down. He breathed the post-rain air, which had the chalk smell of Wiltshire, mineral and clean, as unlike London air as it was possible for air to still technically be air. He got in his car. He drove east, back toward London, back toward the flat in Pimlico, and the broken radiator, and the man with the 11-year archive, and the open door. In his pocket, the envelope pressed against his ribs. Anne Prescott, 41 years, the complete shape of it, held in memory, unspoken, intact. Gerald Finch drove through Wiltshire, and thought about what it meant to hold something true for 40 years and say nothing, and what it meant when the silence around that truth was finally broken, not by intention, or not entirely, but by a woman in a navy coat walking through a palace gate on a Tuesday morning in February, with a brooch catching the light. He thought about whether that was an accident. He thought about whether anything, in that world, was an accident. He thought about Anne Prescott, 72 years old, 41 years of service, the complete shape of something held in memory and never spoken. He thought about what it would take to make her speak. He drove. London came up ahead of him in its grey and enormous way, the envelope pressed against his ribs. He had a call to make that he was not looking forward to a man with an 11-year archive who was waiting in a flat in Pimlico for someone to tell him what was real. He picked up the phone. He drove east. He called Thomas Ashworth and he said, first, it was real. It was all real. And then he said, there is one more thing we need to do, and it is the hardest thing, and you are going to need to trust me, and it is going to take longer than either of us would like. And Thomas Ashworth, who had been staring at a ceiling in a flat with a broken radiator for 2 days, and had not slept properly, and had eaten his eggs every morning with the specific discipline of a man holding himself together through routine, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, all right. 2 words. The archive open. The door open. February light. All right. Royal Guard spots Camilla wearing late Queen's secret jewel, Palace in Uproar.